Fragments of Silicon, rebounding even after attempts at disconnection by Lumberjack. All right, welcome to another installment of the Fragments of Silicon, the Daylight Interviews. So, this is a reattempt at an interview we tried to do a few weeks ago that unfortunately got interrupted by, well, as mentioned by the Chop, some illegal lumberjacking. I'm like, we are presuming that that's not going to happen this time around because that is just such a random roll of the dice.
The serendipity on that, I'd be going to go buy a lottery ticket while they bring the internet back up.
Yes,
when you say illegal lumberjacking, it makes it sound like we've all been sitting in trees or something, like interrupting our show while we're sitting in our trees.
Yeah, give it about 100 years.
Well, that or Canadians are trying to interrupt this broadcast.
Fair.
Anyway, so joining us on the program this week is Joseph Humfrey of Inkle.
Hello.
Hello. Right. So, given that I think the old bits of this, even though they were captured, have been since deleted, so we will have to do everything over again.
Sure, no problem.
With that in mind, right. So tell us how you got started making video games, both, and what also sparked your interest in video games in the first place.
It's a funny one because I feel like I've been into video games almost as long as I can remember. Having said that, my history of video games as a child was slightly unconventional in that I never had a games console. I didn't even have a PC. I had a Mac. My family had Macs as I was growing up, so my game playing ability, other than going over to friends' houses to play on, Super Nintendo or Sega. I think, what do you call it? Genesis in the US. We called it Mega Drive here.
Right.
So there were other kids who had those consoles that I would occasionally play, and I loved Zelda: Link to the Past and so on. But at home, I was limited to having a Mac, so I played. There were some amazing Mac exclusives that very few people have played, unless you're that kind of 5% of computer owners who had a Mac. For example, there was a brilliant space game called Escape Velocity that I absolutely loved. That was a real classic. But then there were a bunch of games that were ported or that were even made kind of simultaneously from Mac and PC. So like the LucasArts Adventures, we were lucky enough to get them. And so I definitely loved adventure games, as well as, of course, Myst and Riven, which were actually initially created for Mac, and then ported to Windows afterwards. So yeah, basically my love of games comes from Mac gaming, actually, and my game development career kind of spawned out of just experimenting with games as a child and doing mods for games and poking around with like game files and stuff, which I loved doing as well. It was really fun, especially in Escape Velocity, creating missions by editing the game files and making new ships and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's outside of the Mac part, that's probably the more esoteric part of the story here, as far as people getting into the industry, because we've had quite a few tinkerers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I think maybe I don't know what the path is nowadays. I think maybe is it more common nowadays to kind of get started with tools like Game Maker, and like there's an RPG making one as well, I think, and of course Unity is, and there's a bunch of
Yeah.
engines nowadays that just make game making super accessible. So in some ways you don't need to be like modding games, but there's definitely a big modding scene still, isn't there? Or at least I kind of notice. I always notice the big ones. Like there's loads of mods for Elder Scrolls, like Skyrim. There are big Skyrim mods, and people make
Right.
levels for first-person shooters, right? I don't know. I
I
don't
mean-
know. I don't know how it compares with 20 years ago, because I know what it was like 20 years ago, but I don't really know what it's like today.
Well, first-person shooter modding is a lot more the same than you'd think.
Hmm.
But that's its own conversation. Like,
Yeah.
what people are doing with GZ Doom and the like.
Right. Oh, right. Yeah. Retro game modding. Yeah. Because I was about to
Yeah.
say, like, if you want to make a level for like Source Engine, like one of the Valve games, then it's as complicated as being a level designer for Valve, because it's extremely complex because the visual fidelity has gone up so high. But at least back in the day, if you were doing a Doom mod, it was much quicker to make a Doom level than it is nowadays to make a level in Source Engine or something, or in
Yeah.
Unreal.
Yeah, like we're a long way from the heyday of, say, Gary's mod. That is
Right.
true. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, you have things like Minecraft.
Oh, yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah.
You know, that's a big fertile ground for new modders.
Hmm.
Granted,
Yeah, because there's kind of there's a nice on ramp, isn't there, from like being in survival mode in Minecraft, just building your own underground house, and then going into creator mode and kind of just building something bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you can go as high as the guy who made an entire working computer in Minecraft.
indeed, like, and of course, there's also much more in the way of educational resources these days.
Hmm.
In
Yeah,
that there are educational resources.
yeah.
Like, I mean,
And actually, like in schools as well, like that teachers are encouraged to use tools like Scratch. Um, in fact, I was helping out one of my neighbors like last year because she was doing teacher training, and as part of her teacher training, she was having to learn how to use Scratch so that she could in turn teach it to students, which I found particularly amusing. That to become a teacher, you have to learn some of these programming tools, which is pretty cool, actually.
mm-hmm.
And it's kind of refreshing as well, because when I was a child, it's not like I had any help from any teachers. I sort of feel a bit indignant about that. I just had to find my own way because none of the adults knew any better than I did.
Well, yeah, I'm like, it was potentially feasible that teaching how to design games could have been a thing at that point, but
Mm-hmm.
even then, video games was so new.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, so with that facilitating your passion for developing games, what was your path into the industry?
So I guess while I was at university, I'd started making little indie well, the term indie didn't really exist back then, but I guess I was making little games as a teenager. But I remember when I was around 18 or maybe 19, in my first year of university, I remember thinking, right, I've done so many little game projects but never quite finished one, and so I kind of challenged myself to finish one. And so it was while at university that I kind of released my first indie game that I called Primate Plunge, partly inspired by Donkey Kong Country from Rare, and having a platformer with monkeys in it. But what was interesting about that game is that it had a portrait aspect ratio, which made zero sense at the time because there were no mobile phones, there were no smartphones back then that would have been capable of running a game like that. But it wasn't until a few years later when the iPhone came out that actually a game like that would have been perfect on a smartphone because it was kind of an infinite. You get these infinite climber games or infinite jumper games, I think like Doodle Jump. It was sort of like that, but it was a game where you infinitely fall down. And that won a little Mac game developer competition, which was really encouraging. And then at the end of university, that really helped me when I was applying to video game companies. Because even back then, I didn't know whether I was actually going to get into the game industry. I knew I was just doing computer science at university, and I thought I might become a computer programmer. But the idea of getting into the video game industry sort of still felt like a childish fantasy at the time. But then I did apply to video game companies afterwards, and I got my first job at Rare, and spent 4 years working there. And I really loved it there. It's a fantastic company to work for, and they have such a great community. That was a really great introduction to the industry.
Right. And what would have been some of the games that you would have worked on at Rare?
So I joined just as the Xbox 360 was launching. And the way it's set up at Rare is that you basically, new starters at the company will start in their kind of technology group, and you can make it known to them that it is like some people just stay there and they work on the shared technology. I don't know if it's still like this, but this is how it was when I was there, that you might start in the shared technology group and some people enjoy that and they stay there. And then some people just sort of say, I want to work on actual games. I want to be a gameplay programmer or something. And then you sort of get placed on a queue of developers who are waiting to join one of the game teams. And I had the choice because a position became open on their handheld team, which was at the time still making Nintendo DS games, despite the fact that Microsoft had bought Rare a few years before. But because Microsoft didn't have a handheld console themselves, they still let Rare carry on making handheld games. And so I was placed in this queue, and they said, do you want to join the handheld team? There isn't a place on one of the Xbox 360 teams. And I thought, well, I really don't want to be carrying on working just on shared technology. I really want to get my hands dirty on making a game. But do I want to wait a few more months to get to work on the brand new Xbox 360? And I just decided I was too impatient and I wanted to work on a game. And so I went to work on Nintendo DS games. And so the first game that I worked on was a DS port of Diddy Kong Racing. And honestly, it was a great experience, and I have absolutely zero regrets, because in a way it was like I was stepping back in time to work in the N64 era, because really the DS is so similar in power to the N64, and because it was kind of a small console in your hands, it was also underpowered compared with like the console generation, like the Xbox 360. And so it was genuinely like stepping back in time to work on the N64. And nowadays I really appreciate that I had that experience, because it's like my career feels like it's spanned all the way back to the N64 era, which is kind of cool, I think.
I mean, I can certainly see the angle there, especially since Diddy Kong Racing was an actual
Exactly.
N64 game.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly
And like,
what did you do on the DS version of Diddy Kong Racing?
so it was my first step into. It was my very first job. So I was kind of doing quite menial jobs to start with. They needed someone to basically do the coding for all of the kind of the scenery and little interactive things in the world. But the more I did, the more I kind of got more input over the game, because it was a team that was like only 10 to 15 people, and so when you have a team that size, you do get to have a say in a lot of things, and have quite a lot of input on the game. That's one of the other good things about not working on Xbox 360, is that proportionally speaking, you have a bigger role, and you've kind of got more creative input. And in fact, that came more into play on the second game that I worked on, which was Viva Pinata DS.
Pocket Paradise.
Yes, that's the one, exactly. And for that one, I think they realized that I was not just interested in coding, but also design as well. And having grown up with Macs, I was also interested in user interface and kind of UI design. That kind of I was unusual in that respect, because in the game industry, UI design isn't kind of respected in the same way as it is if you're like working on iOS or iPad. Because if you work on iOS, it's sort of seen like, the UI is super important and people are super proud of UX design. But if you work in the game industry, it's more like, oh, are you just the guy who like makes health bars or something while we're making the actual like gameplay? But in the case of DS, it was quite important, because the touch interface is so integral to the way that the game works, especially on a kind of a management game like Viva Pinata. So that was really enjoyable, kind of designing the user interface for the Xbox 360 game in a way that worked with touchscreens. It really got me into it.
Yes, I remember having the DS version of Viva Pinata, and it was
Mhm.
shockingly good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, like especially since it was pretty comparable to the Xbox 360 version.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah, the
obviously
gameplay mechanics, we tried to keep all of the like the basic mechanics, like the interactions between all of the different types of pinata, all of the plants and trees and everything. They had all the same set of rules, and then it was just finding a way to kind of technically make it feasible, basically on the equivalent of N64 hardware, while also trying to retain some aspect of the beauty that the Xbox 360 game had as well.
Mm.
Excuse me.
I mean, I think it did a reasonable job.
Yeah, and it was also the other thing that I liked about being on a small team is I not only did I get a chance to have a hand in the game design and the UX design, but I even was, I even had a hand in doing some of the art for it. So I was sort of doing a bit of technical art, even though that role doesn't really exist in the DS or N64 era. I was kind of drawing the grass textures and some of the like rocks and water and stuff, because I was kind of straddling the role between like programming and art, and so I was really getting my hands dirty with that side of game development, which you really kind of don't get the opportunity to do in the more AAA side of things. And after leaving that team, I didn't get another opportunity to do art until I left to found Inkle. So yeah, it was a great opportunity, actually.
Hmm. I suppose the bridging question here is: did the development lessons that you learned on making these DS titles actually help you in making the Inkle set of games?
Yeah, I don't know. I think all experience is useful, and certainly, like, I guess, um, yeah, I definitely had like the experience of working on touchscreens must have helped to some degree. I think for any project you do, you basically it's the sum of your all of your past experiences which add up to help you. Because actually, like, because I spent so much time as a child as well, like doing little game development experiments, even though I didn't finish a game until I turned 18 or 19 or something. Like I've basically been doing some form of game development all my life. I think I like making games more than I like playing games, like significantly more actually. And I feel like I'm only just coming to terms with that right now. But yeah, certainly. By the time I'd started at Inkle, I'd I'd spent a lot of time working on all sorts of different prototypes and UI experiments. I'd already ported that game Primate Plunge that I made as a teenager. I'd experimented with porting that to iPhone as well, so I'd had a little bit of experience on iOS, even while I was still at Rare, just playing around in my spare time.
Hmm. So, what motivated you to help found Inkle?
So after working at Rare, I I moved over to Cambridge, where I worked at Sony's Cambridge studio that eventually became Gorilla. It became part of Gorilla before it shut down. Um, that studio shut down. But while I was there at Sony, I met John Ingold, who was also working there. And basically, from my first day, I was sitting next to John, and we got chatting. And it turned out we both liked narrative games. And I think it was after Fahrenheit had come out. What's the American name for Fahrenheit? It was like
Project Indigo.
that's the one, exactly. So it was after that had come out, but it was just before Heavy Rain came out, and we just got talking about that style of game and what we thought the potential was, and how there were so many, like the Bethesda and BioWare games, and how the conversation interfaces were so kind of, in some ways, they were really like really high production, but at the same time, the conversations you have with NPCs were always so robotic, and we just started talking about like how we would improve it. And like I said, all my life I've been working on game development prototypes and experiments, and so I just said to him, it must have been within a couple of weeks of starting at Sony, like, oh, I'll give a try, I'll give a go at making a little prototype to see what an alternative interaction with NPCs would be like. And I only ended up spending about 2 years at Sony, because after 2 years of kind of making friends with John and us chatting about narrative games and stuff, it didn't take long before we were like, we should start a company together, because John he was a designer while he was at Sony, but really his heart was in writing. And so at Inkle, he's a writer and a designer. And I'm the kind of the jack of all trades, who does the rest of everything. So yeah, we founded Inkle together in 2000, and at the end of 2011, where I was kind of doing programming and art, and we were kind of designing the games together, and he was doing the writing and really kind of spearheading the interactive narrative side of things, because he's got a history of interactive fiction, and he spent a lot of time thinking about interactive narrative. And so, yeah, that's when we started Inkle.
Indeed. And I would say Inkle has become renowned for its explorations and divinations into narrative adventure.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I guess we've always been kind of restless in a design sense. Like when we work on a project and we finish a project, we're always thinking, well, how could we improve on that, or how could we do something different? Or if there's been another game that's come out, we might think, oh, we've got some ideas on how to improve on that. And it's quite unusual for us to kind of work on a sequel. In fact, one of the only sequels we've worked on so far have been because it's been we made a version of the Sorcery series by Steve Jackson, which was a game book from the 80s, and it was a 4-part series that we'd converted initially for iPhone and iPad. And because it was a 4-part series, we were sort of committed to doing that 4-part series. But otherwise, we find it very hard to make sequels because we always want to find new experiments, new ways to push the genre forwards, and really kind of, I guess we're never quite satisfied with the kind of the narrative or the I guess the technical construction of how the narrative works in a game, or we're always thinking, oh, what would happen if you tried to put a really fluid, responsive narrative in this other genre of game that we don't think we've seen a good version of before. So yeah, we like working in different genres as well.
Yes, we've covered a number of games from your studio on the program over the years,
Mhm.
and that's emerged because, yeah, sorcery is vastly different than, say, Heaven's Vault.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, part of this has been about us, the company growing over time, and we started with something that was fairly technically straightforward. In that, like, Sorcery was a text-based, basically an interactive book with a nice lush fantasy map behind it. So it wasn't much more than rendering, a simple landscape with text boxes on top, while trying to make the narrative as responsive and fluid as we could. But then as we grew and we found success in games like that in 80 Days, we had the budget to make bigger games like Heaven's Vault. But then after Heaven's Vault, actually, that for us. That was the largest game we've ever made, and in some ways, while we enjoyed that and we were very proud of that, we were also sort of realizing that by making really massive games, it kind of slows you down because you have to be really working for years and years on this one project. Whereas when we worked on smaller games, it allows us to work on a greater variety of projects and try different kind of experiments. So after Heaven's Vault, we worked on a game called Overboard, which was sort of a distraction during COVID while we were supposed to be working on our most recent game, A Highland Song, and then we just felt nostalgic for making smaller games, and we returned to making a game more of the scope of our older ones to make Overboard. I guess I should probably explain what some of these games are, perhaps, for some of your listeners who might not know them.
Fair enough. Go, especially Overboard.
Yeah. So Overboard is a reverse murder mystery, is what we call it. So it's sort of an Agatha Christie sort of story where you're on a ship that's bound for New York, coming from the UK, and there's a murder, but the twist is that you did it. So that's the kind of the story setup, and it's not about trying to find out who did it because you did it. It's about trying to cover up the murder. So it's sort of a simulated story space in that with a time loop. So you start off in your cabin, you've committed a murder, and you can explore the ship and talk to the characters on the ship. It's got this kind of comic book style presentation, and the characters will all kind of go about their business following their schedule of what they would do that day, but you can mess with them, you can try to pin the murder on them, you can cover up evidence and see if you can get away with it. And if you don't manage, you can replay. So it's kind of infinitely replayable with a bunch of different endings and ways that you can achieve your goal. And it's got a nice kind of edge of humor running through it as well.
Right. So I think that's a good place to shift to a Highland song here.
Sounds good.
So for those who might not know or who might not been paying attention to what's been going on actually on screen, what is a Highland song?
So a Highland Song's our most recent game. It's a kind of a semi-open world 2D platformer set in the Highlands of Scotland. You play the role of a girl called Moira McKinnon, who's running away from home over the Scottish Highlands, and you're trying to reach the sea. You're trying to get to this lighthouse where your uncle Hamish lives, because he sent you a letter saying you have to come to the sea. He's got something wonderful to show you. Something very special is going to be happening, and you can't wait to get away from home because you've got a pretty nasty mother, and so you run away from home, and so you're out in this rugged landscape that's a kind of a semi-open world where the game kind of takes place on these 2D layers that sort of look like a 2D platformer game, except that it also has depth as well. So as you explore the 2D space, you find these kind of trapdoors that let you, or that are just kind of paths through the hills that let you go from one layer to the next layer in depths. So the kind of the hills that you see in the background are all hills that you can visit. It's kind of like the 2D equivalent of that cliche that you hear from 3D open world games, that you see that hill in the background, you can go there. Well, it's that, except it's kind of a 2D game where all of the hills in the background, the parallax layers, you can really go there and explore and find your way through the Scottish Highlands. And then one of the main mechanics, while you're kind of climbing and exploring the landscape, is we have this rhythm action mechanic where when you run through the valleys, sometimes this Scottish folk music will start and you have to jump in time to the music. And those kind of form these kind of crescendos of excitement and flow. It's kind of a flow state while you travel from hill to hill.
Yes, I think Petty was doing a sequence of that not too long ago.
Oh yeah. I've just refreshed the Twitch stream so I can see where you are.
Yeah. Right. So I suppose we should begin at the beginning, so to speak. That is to say, what prompted Inkle to create this particular title? Like, what made you want to tell a story of the Highlands?
So, in addition to being a Mac gamer growing up, I grew up in Scotland. And I grew up absolutely loving the Scottish Highlands, because I had this amazing teacher who took a bunch of the kids up into the Scottish Highlands to go walking and camping. which was a really amazing opportunity, just because like it was a bit of a crazy teacher, to be honest, because he let us, like, while we went camping, he even let us kind of explore the hills, like in groups of 3 or 4 kids on our own. We must have been maybe 10 or 11 years old, and he sent us off on our own. He did watch from the path. Oh, it looks like you just died. Whoops. um, he did watch from the path, which was like might have been like a mile away in the distance, but we were genuinely left with the freedom to explore this wild landscape. Um, and so I always loved the hills from that point. And then when I was older, as a teenager, I went up into the Highlands with some friends from school, and we foolishly got lost while we were exploring, and we got really very, very lost because in some regions of the world, like in the German or Austrian Alps, it's surprising that although the hills are really vast, much bigger than the Scottish hills in terms of height, it's very rare that you find somewhere that isn't within a mile or so of a road where you could drive past, because it's been quite civilized, I suppose. Whereas in Scotland there are genuine vast areas of wilderness, and although Scotland isn't a huge country, you only have to have kind of 10 miles of uninterrupted wilderness with basically nothing there before it becomes genuinely quite dangerous if you get lost. So it was quite late in the evening by the time we were quite lucky. We ran into a deer stalker, which is kind of like a hunter who manages deer in the wilds, and he drove us back near to our start point, still at the top of the top of a mountain as it was getting dark. But he pointed in the right direction to for the way for us to get back to our car. But it was quite a scary experience, and kind of really drove home the kind of duality of the Highlands, that it can be both beautiful but also very dangerous if you're not careful. And so that's kind of a feeling that we want to capture in the Highlands, in a Highland song. That kind of two-sided nature of the Highlands, that it's easy to get lost, it can be very dangerous, but it's also beautiful at the same time.
I can see what you're going for there. Like, such duality isn't that uncommon in narrative, but I do have to admit, you don't often get it using mountain and foothills.
Sorry, say that again?
It's like, it's not the most explored medium in terms of, the duality of beauty and danger. Like, mountains. I'm not going to say that it's wholly unique, because, a lot of wilderness survival material will point out how beautiful, wilderness of all kinds will be, but also, dangerous, whether it be due to cliff shears or wolves.
Yeah, no,
anyway.
It's interesting. Yeah, there's obviously there's a whole genre which is survival games, and one line that is quite hard to tread is like, we didn't want to make it purely a survival game, because we wanted to keep the emphasis on narrative, and we didn't want you to keep dying a gruesome deaths, which is why, as you saw in this playthrough, you saw if you do fall off something very high and die when you hit the ground at the bottom, we didn't want it basically to reset you or or be super gruesome, because we did want to also have this kind of more fairy tale narrative side to the game. So the survival angle, we kind of toned that down quite a bit during development so that it wouldn't be too punishing.
Yeah, and not for nothing, there are games that exist in that space, like The Forest,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
is a particularly interesting title because that combines narrative with survival. Granted, we're trading biomes a bit, mountains and for the forest, but it is still something that's doing similar things, not the same thing, because once again, it's very much about living, where this
Mm-hmm.
is much more story focused.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what about the narrative to a Highland song? What did you want to do here that you hadn't done before, or you felt needed to be done?
So the story, we started off basically with a tone that we wanted to convey, that we wanted to create this kind of magical realist world where it's grounded, and it feels like a realistic world to some extent. It's not like it's not like a Mario kind of thing. It's also not gritty. We want it to be naturalistic, but at the same time we wanted to have like slight fantasy elements where the fantasy was also light touch. So any fantasy we have in the game, we wanted to basically allow the narrative to we wanted the player to be able to believe that it could be an excuse that Moira was just telling herself. Like, if you were to tell this story in retrospect, you might say, oh, that isn't quite what happened, though, is it? It was maybe a slight exaggeration. It's that kind of magical realist genre where it's not full on fantasy, it's just like little touches of mythology and perhaps exaggeration of a story. So that was the overall tone we were going for, and then because it's sort of a coming of age story, because Moira is a teenager, she's just on the kind of she's just at the point of transitioning from being a girl to a woman, and so we wanted to introduce themes of family as well. So if you've played the game to the end, you there's kind of a revelation towards the end, and at the same time, the way that the narrative is constructed, it's told in a lot more kind of light touch way than games that we've made previously. There's a lot more kind of gamey jumping and climbing than some of our previous games. So it's more about telling this kind of ambient narrative that's maybe slightly more in the background than some of our previous games. So the way we wanted to tell the story, we wanted it to be something that you sort of ambiently discover as you play, rather than kind of one of our previous games that were more like kind of point and click adventures, where you go from one scene to another, and in each scene some narrative event happens. It's not quite the same construction in this game. So that's the kind of the basic shape of the way we decided to kind of design the narrative.
That is an interesting direction to go, though perhaps not wholly unexpected, given that, as you mentioned, this is much more of a video game than
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
previous projects.
Mm-hmm.
Like, um, That being said, it sounds like your methodology for storytelling differs quite a bit as well.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how much of a challenge was it to switch from very text heavy narrative to something that's much more environmental?
So that's partly a question that John would have to answer because he's kind of the writer and the narrative expert. But um, part of that switch is because after Heaven's Vault, we thought it would be interesting because all of our games up until and including Heaven's Vault, we kind of co-directed all of them. So it was kind of 50-50, both of us, in terms of direction. And after that, we decided we'd try experimenting with a slightly different structure where we would more take it in turns to lead. So we might have a game that's more kind of like more 60 to 70% John and 30 or 40% me, or vice versa. And so Overboard is an example of a very John-centric game. He was the kind of the lead on that game. He was the director. So that's why that one's more kind of more narrative centric, whereas a Highland Song is kind of the concept is mine, and I was the director on this game. So because although I'm obviously interested in narrative and I love narrative games and always will, I also love more traditional game mechanics. And I have a background in enjoying, games like Prince of Persia was a big influence on this as well. The kind of the 2D grounded platforming mechanics. So the fact that you see the narrative slightly backgrounded in this game is a kind of a natural outcome of the way I would design a game myself to be kind of. It's hard to say gameplay first because they really kind of work hand in hand. But that's why it kind of superficially it kind of has a more gamey kind of look about it. But it's kind of interesting to have kind of take games from the direction of like Heaven's Vault and Sorcery, where we really learnt some really good techniques of integrating narrative into gameplay mechanics, and it's been fun using all of those techniques to basically try to make a narrative that's really responsive in that like actions that you take in the world will have narrative outcomes, and the player will respond to everything you do, which it's one of our favorite things that we like to do.
And is that philosophy still found here in a Highland Song?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Like, so we try to put as many hooks into the narrative as possible. So any of the in-game, anything that happens in game, whether it's like, falling from a great height or she gets hurt, like there are narrative systems that will like kick in response to all of these events, so that hopefully you'll feel like the narrative is completely paying attention to every little thing that you do, whether it's kind of, even just stopping when you run out of breath and you have to stop a moment to catch your breath. Like she might just say a line like a bark like there where she said, "Ah, damn!" Like that's all the narrative there is responding to what's happening in the gameplay, and that's the exact same narrative which controls all of the interactions in the game. So it's maybe not something we do here, but what we could do is if you like after 5 or 10 times of falling off a cliff, you could combine that with if you're in a cave, it would remember what you did previously and combine these events together. We have the power to basically respond to everything that the player does in the game to create unique narratives for any circumstance that we like. And part of that's because of our tools that we have. We've made our own narrative engine that we've used in all of our games called Ink.
Mm-hmm. And how did you adapt that to a Highland song?
So I guess the first time that we made a game that was like not 100% text based was a Heaven's Vault, and we learned a bunch of techniques ever since then. Of although the Ink engine was originally designed for a basically choice based interactive narrative, we have we can basically make use of the exact same tools of basically the basic building blocks of having choices and text, and inside the game, even outside of the text that you read, there's other text going on. So some of the text might not be presented as text that you can read, but rather they're like instructions to the game. So it might generate a piece of text which says, move the camera out smoothly, or change to this camera shot, or hurt Moira because something has happened in the narrative that ought to affect her health. So we've got all of these tools available to us, and it's not just these kind of instructions. It's also like there's a type of choice which is enter door. So when you approach a door, it actually makes a choice in the narrative to go to a different narrative section in the script for what happens when you enter a building. So a lot of the sequencing is actually controlled by this interactive narrative engine. And it wasn't a massive leap going from Heaven's Vault to a Highland song. With that respect, we kind of learnt all of the techniques that we needed on previous games to be able to make this one.
Well, I mean, that's a good transition.
Yeah, no, it's been great discovering all of these techniques, because it's meant that we have a good foundation, a good starting point anytime we want to make a new game. And one of the nice things about it is the separation that it allows John to go ahead and start writing narrative before we've even finished building our game systems, and he can test that out in isolation, which is really helpful.
Right. So the game has been out for a few months, depending on the platform. What's been the reception been?
Yeah, it's been really lovely, actually. It's been fantastic. Not every game can appeal to everyone. There's certain people who didn't like it as much as some of our previous games, but for the most part, it's been fantastic, and we've been really delighted with the response. It's been one of our best reviewed games so far, I think.
I couldn't verify that offhand. Like, I honestly haven't looked at too many of the review scores, but I wouldn't be surprised either, because in general, your titles seem to review very, very well.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, we're always hoping that one day we'll have the elusive kind of 100% universally praised, but because we're sort of often working quite experimental blends of genres, it means we're never kind of truly refining the one genre, and so it's hard to do that. So often we're kind of averaging 80-85% on Metacritic for our games. But that's okay. We're happy with that.
indeed. And the game is currently out now for the Nintendo Switch and Windows. Is that on mobile yet?
It's not on mobile right now. It probably won't be, just because I'm not a big fan of like simulated gamepad controls, and it's hard to see how we could do it using 100% kind of innovative touch input. It's probably possible, but we'd have to think about that. We don't have any plans right now.
Like, no, I get you. Like, I don't care for that style either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I know there are plenty of people who do, but
Mm-hmm.
these are people who were raised on touchscreens.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like, look, I get it. It's all you've known. Like, anyway, um, now is this game slated to come to the PlayStation or Xbox series of consoles?
We don't have any plans right now, but never say never. We'll see. Um, we'll see. We're not sure right now.
Uh, okay. Well, hopefully a decision will be forthcoming there. Like,
Well, we just don't have any active plans right now. So, I mean, we're working on other stuff right now. Right now, we're working on a content update for a Highland song, where we'll be adding new music, probably some new wildlife, and we'll see. Maybe some narrative as well. We're not sure, but we're working on that right now. And yeah, honestly, we founded Inkle 13 years ago now, and we're quite keen on just having a couple of months break for a bit because we've been working basically non-stop since we founded the company. So yeah.
right. Though, before we conclude here, I do want to mention your, I suppose, for a lack of verbiage here, your latest project,
Yes.
ish.
Yeah.
And that is the Forever Labyrinth, which
Yes.
just came out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a curious little collaboration
Yeah.
because, well, it's a narrative browser game done in
Yeah.
association with Google's Arts and Culture division.
That's right. So Google approached us and said, "Look, we have this massive database of fine art and photographs of sculpture um, that's kind of mostly used for education purposes, but they like making experimental games with them, and they go to developers and ask if they have any concepts that they would like to try. And so they asked us because they were a fan of our work. Um, and initially, we were going to refuse because we were busy working on a Highland song. But John, an idea came to John, a concept appealed to him, and because I was leading this project, I didn't really. I did a little bit of work on defining the art style of the Forever Labyrinth, but it was kind of the project was concurrent with a Highland song, so I didn't do much work on it. It was mostly John's baby because he'd basically mostly finished his side of things on a Highland song, and so he was starting on a side project basically on the Forever Labyrinth. It's kind of it's a bit of a smaller project, but it's also quite sizable in its own right. But yeah, so it's a game set in this kind of this labyrinth, this maze of interconnected rooms that are semi-procedurally generated, where each room can contain a bunch of paintings from the Google Arts and Culture library. And the magical thing about the game is that these paintings form portals between rooms, and so you have to find your way through this maze by focusing on the paintings and finding commonality within the paintings with particular subjects. And so by focusing on a particular subject, like boats or horses or whatever, like you can jump between rooms within the maze. And then as you explore the maze, There's a narrative, of course, that runs through it, and you discover all sorts of secrets. And it's infinitely replayable with kind of a procedurally generated maze that gets created each time you play. So it's kind of definitely a very experimental game, but super interesting.
Mm. It sounds like it's a better use for that kind of collection than generative AI, let's say.
Yes,
But
absolutely. Yeah.
that is a argument for another day, I think.
And
Yes.
probably another podcast, let's be real.
Yeah, well,
That's more than 1 hour's conversation, I would say, just on that one topic.
yes, it is, and unfortunately, our time draws to a close here. Um, But Joe, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule and being with us here today, and thankfully rolling with the punches, as it were, with the technical failures of last time.
No
But
problem at all. It's been a pleasure chatting here, and yeah, thanks for inviting me on.
no problem, no problem. Right, so the game is a Highland Song. It's currently available now for PC platforms and the Nintendo Switch for $17.99. Also, there is the Forever Labyrinth, which you can play for free on on your Google browser or on your browser. Does
Yeah,
it
any
have to be
browser.
on?
Yeah,
Yeah, I was about to.
works on
Yeah.
mobile devices as well as desktop. Yeah.
Okay. So be sure to check them out today. Right. And right. So that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. Be sure to tune in next time for our Sunday reviews. And until then, I shall wish you good gaming.